Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, To the Stars, with SEDS at IUPUI, which stands for Students for the Exploration and Development of Space. This is our inaugural episode, and we are joined by a very special guest, our very own advisor, Dr. Peter Schubert. Dr. Schubert is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at IUPUI's Purdue School of Engineering and Technology. He is also a director at the Richard G. Lugar Center for Renewable Energy, which aims to create opportunities for Indiana to lead the country towards the future of energy. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy. What inspired you to start off in electrical engineering and ECE and then transition into talking about space and getting interested in space?
We're at a very historic moment just this week with two private citizens going to the edge of space in their own rocket ships. This is a tremendous advance and was something that would be hard to anticipate before that. I think this is going to be an inspiration to a lot of people. So I think that will have a similar impact on the youth of today as I had when the Apollo 11 landing happened on the 20th of July in 1969. So I was just a wee tyke then. I had an aunt who worked for a company in Cleveland that worked on the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, and she had somehow made a copy of the plans for the lunar module. And she'd put it into a manila envelope and gave this to me. So I had no idea I was going to be an engineer at this time, but I was looking through these drawings and looking at the television. I was like, oh my gosh, I know what these things are called. And then they landed on the moon and they hopped around. And I was like, well, I want to do that too. So that was, my whole generation got all excited about space because of that. And then we call some of these people the orphans of Apollo because the Apollo missions went so far, so fast that we thought by the 1980s, we'll have space stations, and by the 2000s, we'll be on Mars. Well, none of that has happened yet. But now, after a long period of there being almost nothing, now things are really starting to take off. So I think there's a parallel between what I went through at a formative age and what people are experiencing right now that will start getting them to think about what can I live and do and experience in space.
How did you kickstart your research experience, and what were your initial successes in research?
When I was 13 years old, there was a oil embargo. And the oil embargo meant that suddenly gasoline, which at that time was 22 cents a gallon, all of a sudden you couldn't get it at any price. And people lined up with their cars. This has never happened in the history of America. So at 16, I was just a few, or 13, I was a few years away from 16 where you can start to drive. And, you know, driving is the great American freedom, as they say. And I was very much looking forward to that in just a couple more years. So when this started happening and I saw these long lines through my hometown, I thought, this is not fair. It's now finally my turn. And now you can't get gas. This is terrible. And then the next winter, we had the president, that was Jimmy Carter at the time, and he was a nuclear engineer, the only time we've had an engineer as the president of the United States. And he said, we're in an energy crisis, not just gas, not just oil, but also overall, we were having more demand than there was supply. And the pollution from the 60s, there was a huge environmental movement against pollution. We're starting to see that again, finally, in our current decade. But back then it was a really big thing and people were very concerned about the pollution from coal and the mercury and the lead and the arsenic and the cadmium and the particulate matter and on and on. So it was really dangerous. Carter says, no Christmas lights. So in my family, we had a tradition of lots of Christmas lights. My dad would go out and put things in the yard. And when the president said no Christmas lights, I thought, okay, things have gone too far. I'm going to dedicate my life to helping assure that we never have these energy crises again for future generations, and we're doing it clean at the same time. I was in New York City, and a man was on the street with these pamphlets, and he's handing out these pamphlets for free. And he says, the Russians are going to beat us at nuclear fusion. This is still when the Cold War was very, very much on. And the Russians were working on fusing hydrogen atoms together to release huge amounts of energy without the radioactive byproducts from fission based on uranium. And I thought, the Russians are going to beat us in this. That can't happen either. So all of a sudden, I was planning to be a poet. I wanted to be a writer when I was in 11th grade, and I took a research paper class, and I decided I'd do something on this nuclear physics stuff that was behind this pamphlet that I got in New York City. And I found that it was really interesting. There was so much more to it that they didn't teach us in high school. I got an A+ in the paper. It was my first A+ in my whole entire life. And that was a pivotal moment where I'm like, I think I might have the mind of a scientist. I was adopted. I never met my birth parents. I found out much later, one was an architect, one was an engineer, but I didn't know this at the time. My father was a businessman. My mom was a nurse. They had no clue on how to raise an engineer. I had nobody in my life that was a mentor or a role model, but I sort of discovered it almost by accident like this. So I decided to go into college and double major in physics and creative writing. So the people in the creative writing classes, they said, aren't you a physics major? I said, yes, and English also. They said, but you're a physics major. You don't belong here. They made me feel bad about myself. They criticized my poetry. So I thought, I don't like these people. So I stayed in physics. Okay, so now fast forward to this year, and now I've got 3 books published. Okay, so it took me a while, but in physics, I found out something very depressing. First of all, physics is great. I love physics, still consider myself a physicist, but they don't care much about practical applications. And when you have a bachelor's degree, I had a BA in physics. The kind of jobs you can get are, you could wash bottles in a laboratory, or you could take temperature data on, menial tasks. There's no practical application, or very few, for a physics undergraduate degree. So I went to my advisor and I said, I don't know about graduate school in physics. I don't want to go into the basement with all the strange physics graduate students and not know what I'm working on. He says, well, some people who can't handle physics, they go into engineering. And he said, there's this thing called solid state electronics, and there's a lot of jobs for that. So I felt like I tucked my tail between my legs. I went into electrical engineering for my master's program. And I found out that of the people starting my master's program, half of them were physics refugees. But the physics of semiconductor devices was directly related to the solid state physics I'd taken as an undergraduate, but it was applied to something. So when we built a transistor in the lab and compared that to the theory we'd studied in the classroom, and it all came together, I thought, I'm an engineer. And now I can work on nuclear fusion. Well, everybody told me nuclear fusion was the energy of the future. All right, this was in the early 80s. And they laughed. This was back in the 1980s. And they said, and we've been saying that for 20 years, and we'll probably always be saying that. So it still hasn't happened, although there's some really exciting developments in nuclear fusion. But I diverted and I got a job. I worked in the automotive industry in Kokomo, Indiana. I was there for 20 years. I became a technical fellow. And then along the way, my avocation, not my vocation, that's your job. Your avocation is like the big thing that you do in a coordinated way that you're not getting paid for. That was space development. And I started reading these books about how people in the 70s and 80s had been very excited with the Apollo program. They're like, okay, we're going to go to asteroids and mine them. We're going to go to the moon and make a base. We're going to go to Mars and build a space elevator. And none of that stuff was happening. And I was like, why did that fizzle out? What was the problem? And what it seemed to me was something very crucial. And that was that people were using Earth-based thinking when they thought about space. I thought, what if I gave myself the constraint of saying, all you got is vacuum, weightlessness, sunshine, and rocks. what could you do with those 4 horrible things? So I started putting together some concepts for that, turned those into inventions that finally got patented in 2003. And so those patents are still active. And then a long story happened, and then I own those patents. So as an individual, those are my patents. I have the key patents on how to go to the moon, process materials to make silicon, titanium, aluminum, oxygen, and from those we can make things like quartz and structural metals, wires and cables, and photovoltaic panels. I've received a NASA grant from that. It took me a long time. He said, when did the research start? I was 37 before I really did research other than master's and PhD. I was working as a worker bee for a long time. And then I finally started research in my mid to late 30s. And then that kind of accelerated. So now I've been 10 years in academia. And now, especially as the director of the Lugar Center for Renewable Energy, I can work on things like space solar power, and that's part of my job scope. So my greatest joy now is to lead teams of students. And I've had probably 30 students that have co-authored papers with me on different aspects of this very complex system of doing space solar power, which answers that question of how do we provide abundant, cheap, renewable, around-the-clock baseload energy to everybody on the planet without polluting it? And that answer is space solar power. So here at IUPUI, we're a major player in that and have published many things under the IUPUI imprimatur. We studied the use of lunar thorium to be able to make uranium to put into nuclear thermal rockets, like this picture up here. And we're the first ones to have even thought of that. I published on that just in 2019, just right before the pandemic hit. And then we've had 2 publications since at the largest space conference in the world with student co-authors. Most of them were undergraduates. And now we got invited to submit to a journal. So conference papers are pretty cool, but journal papers, they're the top of the tier, right? Well, maybe books are above that, but we got invited to submit a paper to the Journal of Space Safety Engineering. We submitted that. The editor-in-chief wrote back and said, this almost never happens, but we accept your paper with no changes. That's the kind of good quality research that's coming out of IUPUI. I just got a note from this morning saying, do you want to pay extra for one of your figures to be color? I said, no, let's just publish it. So that's going to come out very soon as our first journal paper that came out of SEDS. And I'm hopeful that, again, this year and every future year, we can continue this tradition. SEDS has been on our campus for 10 years. We've probably had 8. This will be I think this is our 11th publication.
Thank you, Dr. Schubert. That was a wonderful experience that you just shared about how you wanted to write and this. I personally had that same experience when I came to IUPUI. I'm majoring in electrical engineering, and just for the fun of it, I took a introduction to poetry class. And these are all students of, doing theater, dance, literature, poetry, and I was just engineering. And, luckily they accepted me because I wanted to be part of them. But I totally understand your experience, Dr. Schubert. And in between that conversation, you just told about some patents that you talked about. So I just want to ask this, what are some of your most important scientific discoveries? Were they part of those patents that you were talked about, or was it something else?
This is something that history will have to judge. I found out, I was so frustrated when I was first working for a company because I would be in meetings. You spend a lot of time in meetings in that company. Oh my gosh. I'd be in a meeting and there'd be some topic or some problem we were trying to solve. And then once the problem was presented and we were working towards a solution, many times I would be able to figure out a good solution, maybe the best solution, and I would blurt it out as soon as I thought of it. But people weren't ready for that. A lot of people are process oriented. They need to go through all the steps and then have them lead them gradually and incrementally to the final answer, and then it comes out. So if I pop up and say, what if we did this? Most of the time, people just ignore it. And then what would happen is that once we got near the end of the meeting, then somebody else would say, well, what if we did this? I'm like, I just said that. And people would say, great idea, Gretchen. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so frustrating. So that happened to me enough times. I'm like, all right, I'm not going to be a jerk about it and make everybody have to listen to me because they're not ready. What I'm going to do is hold my tongue. So I'll just doodle and wait until they're ready and then get to the end of the meeting and then go, what if we tried this? And they're going, oh, great idea, Peter. And so all of a sudden I got a reputation as being a really good thinker. The reason I'm bringing that up is that I'm often able to figure out answers of things that other people have not yet figured out. So when you ask about my best invention, I've got a couple of ideas that come to mind, but many of them are ahead of their time. And so if I were to say they're my best invention, maybe it's not time for that yet. Maybe it won't even work out. But one of the things that I'm really excited about that we talked about just before we started is the hydrogen storage with porous silicon. I've got 4 patents on that now, and this story will get right to your question.
Right.
In 2001 and 2003, I was like, okay, well, I've got this plan to save the world with space solar power, and it's going to take me 41 years. So I told my wife about this, and she goes, oh, who thinks that far ahead? She said, well, how can you do it faster? I'm like, things just always take 3 times longer than you think they should. She goes, well, what if you get people excited about it and write a book? So I wrote a book about it. And then I thought, I put that book too far in the future. I didn't have the earlier steps. So I wrote a prequel second. So I turned those things into publishers and got agents involved. And about half of them said the same thing that happened to me in my poetry class. They said, stick to your knitting. You're an engineer. You shouldn't be a writer. You're not one of us. And so I couldn't get it published, partly because they were ahead of their time. So when I went through and took those books that were written in 2001 and 2003, the amount of editing that I had to do for things that I'd missed on or had not gotten correct were very few. So I'm finally publish those things right now. So in the course of writing the first book, which is number 2 in the series, we had space solar power, and it's beaming power wirelessly to the ground. And because it sees the sun all the time, the amount of power is steady over time. It's just a flat, straight line. But the demand for energy goes up in the morning, gets high in the afternoon, stays up in the evening, and then at night drops off as people turn everything off and then they go to bed. So you can't really turn the sun up or down. The solar power satellites, you can't really rotate them out of the way. That takes too much inertial mass. So what do you do with the excess energy you have at night when nobody needs that power? And I thought, oh, we'll just electrolyze water and make hydrogen. And then hydrogen can now replace gasoline, because this time gasoline was $4 a gallon. So I wrote that, and then a couple months later, I went back and I was editing my own work, and I thought, I wonder if anyone's thought of that before. So I did some research, and there was a lot of work on porous silicon, a lot of work on hydrogen storage, but nobody had put those 2 things together. So I turned it into my employer, Delphi Electronics, and they said, we don't do satellites. We're going to kick this over to our sister division in Henrietta, New York. They were working on fuel cells. And they're like, this is kind of interesting stuff. We'll pursue this. So Delphi pursued patent coverage for these ideas. And then I applied to, this is where I first started in the research. I was 37. I applied to a grant proposal and said, this could be a breakthrough way for hydrogen storage. Got my first grant proposal of $88,000. We started doing some research, had some really great advances on it. But then it's been tough because it's been about 5 to 8 years between each time I've got funding on this. But now with the patents granted, 3 of them are owned by the university. 1 is owned by a company that the university created for me in 2016 called Green Fortress Engineering. The website is greenfortressengineering.com. And they gave me majority ownership. They said, you're the CEO/president, and we give you the rights to commercialize your technology. So now we're going to finish up in this next month with our 4th contract with a Japanese firm. Hydrogen is not very popular in the United States. We're all about batteries, but that's come and gone. But the Japanese are very much about hydrogen. So is the EU. but we've now had 4 contracts on doing the research to get to commercialization for hydrogen storage with porous silicon, because we can store hydrogen not at super high pressures, not at super low temperatures, but at the pressure it takes to pump up a bicycle pump by hand. And the cost of this thing is like 1/11th the cost of a battery. If you think of batteries, they're dealing with lithium ions. That has an atomic weight of 7. Hydrogen has an atomic weight of 1. So you have an automatic guaranteed by physics 7 times advantage no matter what with hydrogen. And you don't have to worry about anodes and cathodes. So it's like this 10 or 11 to 1 ratio of energy storage per cost. So we can have both low energy and low cost with benign materials. Silicon is in your fingernails and your hair. This could be the breakthrough that says batteries have so many problems, we can put those aside and use hydrogen for our fuel cell vehicles. We can use hydrogen for our homes. We can use it for grid scale storage. So we could have a home where you have solar panels on your rooftop, water from your basement. We can split that water into hydrogen, store it with this low pressure system. You can use that to power your fuel cell car and your home, and never pay a utility bill again, never go to a gas station again and wait in line, and be completely clean, green, and renewable. And everybody on the planet can have that without utility companies, without all the mess, without all the pollution. This is how I plan to save the planet.
You talk about like a genetic algorithm to optimize different ideas about space architecture. So you go into more detail there. Could you like give a brief explanation about what that algorithm is, and then how do you go about doing that?
I think I have the best architecture, but so does everybody else. My plan is that we first go to the moon. So if we go to the moon, it has those resources for solar panels. The moon is 21% silicon. That's wonderful. That's just wonderful. So if we can separate out the silicon, we can melt that, you have to bring a crystal with you. It's like sourdough. And then once you pull that existing crystal slowly away from the melt, it'll start to solidify and retain the crystal structure. So you can make a continuous ribbon of single crystal silicon that can be diced up and then made into solar panels, all with materials that are on the moon. And that's why I've got the 3 patents on. So with that approach on the moon, now if we launch from the moon into orbit, the energy required is 1/24th of launching it from the Earth. That's just from 1/2 mv squared. The gravity you have to overcome and the momentum that you need to get to orbit is, 0.05 of what it is on the Earth. Plus you have no atmosphere, right? So it's ridiculously easier to launch things from the moon. So what I've been working towards really since the late 90s is to develop factories that are small size that can fit in one rocket, the kind of rockets that Jeff Bezos flew, the kind of rockets that Elon Musk is building, the kind of rockets that Richard Branson will eventually get to. We can take one rocket landing on the moon, and now that can work steadily around the clock, making solar panels like crazy. Then we launch them from the moon into orbit. So now from Earth, all we've launched is one pretty small factory, but now it can make 100 times its own mass in solar panels. We put those into these large solar farms and then start beaming the power back to Earth, and we sell it into terrestrial markets, and we make money that way. So I think this one has the overall best approach, but it's because everybody else has the same passion about their own idea, but I thought I need to step this up to a higher level, get beyond my ego, get beyond their ego. I have a strong ego, but I know a lot of people who have huge egos, and you try to tell them there's something better than their idea, they won't even listen, okay? So how do we get those people on board? That's why I came up with this idea of using the genetic programming to come up with the best architecture, which includes the best ideas from everybody.
Yeah, I was going through that, and it has very step-by-step details about how to go about doing that genetic algorithm in your organization if you wanted to do it. And that could apply to stuff that is also outside the space industry. If you had a lot of people competing for ideas and had a lot of stake in it with their own, like you said, ego, that's kind of hard to transcend. They could follow this genetic algorithm of like having something that represents everyone but is also optimized for whatever metrics that you're trying to optimize for. So that was a great read. So why did you advocate for a systems thinking about space architecture?
When you're in space, everything is difficult. There's so many challenges. It's just ridiculous. So if we only go on missions and have, here's one rocket, one machine, we're going to go out, we're going to go and rove around Mars, for example, or we're going to go fly by Saturn, or we're going to go look at the Kuiper Belt. So all those things are individual missions, but once the mission is over, then they don't leave anything behind. We need to get to the point where we start establishing infrastructure in space to enable multiple missions. Now, NASA has plans for that with the so-called gateway. The gateway would be in a highly eccentric near linear orbit, which is a strange orbit you can get near the moon that loops around it. But as the moon slowly turns and every 29 days, you'd be able to see all surfaces of the moon. And this would be a staging point for people to go down to the moon and come back up, kind of like the command module did in the Apollo era, but a different orbit. So when I was in a space conference, we were listening to the NASA people talking about this, and I turned to the guy next to me, I said, this seems like such a stupid idea. Why would they do that? And he said, it's for military purposes. The United States is worried about, this is just his opinion, I don't know if this is true, worried about bases from China or from Russia that might have military applications. They want to be able to see all the spots on the moon. There's no good stable orbit around the moon, but this rectilinear orbit, near rectilinear orbit, is something that over the course of a month, you'd be able to keep an eye on every spot on the moon. So there may be some politics involved or some considerations other than just making it serve the commercial needs.
Moving on to your fiction formats, from the book Titan of Cislunar Space, you took your work of like space resource utilization and the future of energy and you put that into a fiction format. What was the reason for you to take all of your ideas that you had previously in textbook and then put that into a fictional format?
My first publication in the scientific realm was in 2005. So I was 45 before I started, this is aside from master's and PhD work and that work. But for my own research that I came up with on my own, it was a space exploration conference. And I published on the design of the lunar factories for this. I thought, oh, people are going to be so excited about this, but nobody cared. I went to the International Space Development Conference, or ISDC for short, that's put on by the National Space Society. I've been a member of that since the early 2000s. I mentioned them earlier. Their conference attracts a great many people. It's one of the biggest space conferences in the world, but it's not as technically focused as something from the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA, or the International Astronomical Federation, the IAF. So this one is a lot more space enthusiasts. They're often quasi-technical people or people who are technical in some other field, and aerospace is not their main topic. So I started publishing in those conferences through 2010. And I found that as my papers got better and more appropriate, that the amount of attention I got, which I thought would start to grow, wasn't. I found that almost everybody there had published their own paper, and a lot of people, this is not true of everybody, but a lot of them would have one concept, and then every year you'd hear the same thing again and again. Every time I came, it was something like completely different, carrying things on forward. So I was like, all the people who are in the audience are just waiting for their turn to go up and speak. They're really not interested in teamwork. They're not interested in coordinating. They all want to be the one. So I thought, these people are not ever going to coalesce around my idea. They all feel like their idea is probably better. And then when I started publishing in more technical venues, I found it was very similar, not entirely the same, but in the academic world, people who are doing the most publishing, you're promoted and given tenure based on being an expert in a relatively narrow field where you are the top guy or you are a major contributor. But you're not rewarded for collaborating with other people unless it brings in money. That's always, you get a pat in the back for any time you bring in money to a university, but it's not, the system is not set up either for amateurs or professionals to work together, except at companies. But in the United States, the aerospace primes are generally cost centers for the federal government, and they'll do whatever the federal government says. There's not much tolerance for going off on their own unless it's something that they're sure the government is going to go towards. So that's why the rise of the space billionaires is so exciting, because it can break out of that. But to get back to your question, because I was thinking that this is something where we're not going to coalesce on our own, we have to think of other ways to do that. So that was one of the purposes I had for putting this book together, is that there really isn't another book out there that goes from a systems perspective for the whole gambit. And as you go through that, you might think, okay, well, this is a textbook. It's all going to be equations and stuff. I have an absolute minimum of equations in there. And it's only in the first 4 or 5 chapters that it's the mostly technical stuff. And then it gets in what is called sometimes the soft side. But by doing lobbying and working in companies and all the other experiences I've had, those are all like in a gestalt, in a holistic sense. All of those pieces and parts and elements are needed to work together in order to be successful, to try to get the attention of lawmakers, to try to get the attention of companies, to try to get investors to invest into this, and to be able to do something that's going to provide a benefit back to people at large. When most people think, why spend money in space when we've got all these problems on Earth? You hear that all the time. Most of the population doesn't give a hoot about space. But if we can start bringing definite benefits back to them, that's when we can start really, turning the whole world in a direction that's more positive, that's more sustainable. So that's what I'm trying to do, both with the textbook and with the fiction books.
You talked about like space billionaires, and you supporting the idea of like space billionaires and how they could change things for this cost matching thing that was happening between companies and the government. So could you comment a little more on that?
In 1999, I sent 21 letters to billionaires that had some connection to space. McGraw was one who had come up with a satellite constellation. Looked like it was going to be a really big thing. It didn't turn out into much. It kind of went defunct. So I thought either he or somebody like that was the one who would see the value in my work and maybe help support it. So of the 21 billionaires, or hundreds of millionaire kind of people, only one responded. The only one that responded was Elon Musk. Now, if you've studied him, he thinks space solar power is completely stupid. He also thinks fuel cells, he calls them fool cells. And he's all about energy conversion efficiency. And then in space solar power, if you say the sunlight, which is free, which he ignores, only 22% of that turns into electricity. 22% is a horrible number. Well, if it's free, I say, who cares? And then you only get about half of the power that you generate in space back down on Earth. Well, again, it's free. So it's just an economic thing. It's not wrong just because you've got low efficiencies. If the economics works out, who cares about what the efficiency is? Anyway, I find myself at loggerheads, almost exact opposite of everything Elon Musk does. I didn't start out that way, but that's the way that we are. He wants to go to Mars. I want to go to the moon. I don't care about Mars. I think the moon is where we can make everything happen. He wants batteries. I want fuel cells. He wants to have, I don't know where he's going to get his energy from, but I think it's space solar power. I don't know what ideas he's got for that, but I think in the long run, it'll be very interesting to see which ideas prevail. And I don't have the resources he does to make it happen on my own yet, but it's always possible that somebody could read my book and say, this guy needs to have a big budget. And he's going to call all those students back who've graduated from IUPUI. He's going to give them jobs, and they've all been trained in this. They've all published in this area. They're all experts in different areas. They've all got other experiences. And so in the 10 years I've been at IUPUI, I've been telling this story to all the students who work with me. And so now many of them are out there in the industry. I said, look for me on the television, and I'll be on the nightly news. I'll say, time to come back. Let's save the planet.
Which students who are listening to this podcast and are some IUPUI students, what's your advice for a 21-year-old who's heading forward into this crazy world? What should they do, and what advice would you give them in academics, or what to look for? Either they're going into the space industry or maybe in ECE.
It's 6 words. So in my fiction books, there's the protagonist, that's Parks Van Vliet, and then there's the foil. He's not really an anti-hero because he's got his own objectives, and it's not like he's a bad guy, but it's different. Jinx is a really smart guy, and so I gave him my best quote. So that's what I'm going to give to you. So it's 6 words. It's think hard, think through, think beyond. And that's the framework of how I approach things, because thinking hard is what you need to do in the moment. Focus on what you're doing right now and learn everything as well as you can, because everything that you learn becomes like a foundation upon which you can build more complex things. So over time, you start building, you can think of a pyramid of solid understanding. You can make connections if you know well the individual things you're working on. So think hard. Think through is, where is this taking you, and what does it lead to, and what are the consequences, what are the applications? That can lead you to thinking about commercialization. And if you can do something that solves somebody else's problems, they'll pay you for that. And that's how business happens. That's how progress happens. So that's how you can be successful with your thinking. And then thinking beyond is plan way ahead. If you think really far ahead and say, where do I want to get to eventually? We all know from our life experiences, no matter how old you are, that life throws you curves all the time. You never know what opportunities might come or what opportunities might be lost. But if you have a long-range goal, a long-term vision, a long-term objective for yourself, then no matter where life steers you, you can always kind of keep bending your trajectory back to that long-term goal. I think that'll bring people both prosperity and happiness.
Yes, I'm actually inspired by what you say, Doctor. I feel like we can put a banner up somewhere and put that as our SEDS logo or our SEDS motto, think hard, think through. And yeah, lastly, Dr. Schubert, what are some projects that you're doing right now and you want students at IUPUI to be interested in as like a final thing?
We had a team of mechanical and energy engineering students who built a beast that I call the Kraken. And this apparatus was in the basement of the SL building. So we've just recently taken it down, so it's not an active project in the summer, not new stuff. But that was such a cool project because they could take metal filings and sand particles of the same size and separate them by their density with a water cyclone. So they had an apparatus that we figured this would be less than 1 metric ton, delivered to the moon. So we could use that to sort thorium from the rest of regolith, because there's about a 4 times difference in their density. So we came up with that idea as part of SEDS. Then these students got a couple other mechanical engineers to join them, and they built this thing. And we photographed it, and we put that into a paper. And instead of having a final report, their professor said it would be okay for them to publish a paper on it. So we published a paper on that action, and these were all undergraduates. There were 6 undergraduates working on that project. And this is how we can go and do the basic stuff on the moon. The most cool thing about this is in 2023, the US is planning to go back to the moon. The first 2 landings are already planned. They're going to be mostly publicity. But the third one, they're looking for some cool things to do. And tomorrow there's a lunar surface innovation conference, and I've got a paper to present to them. And this is where I can take that idea developed at IUPUI and proven out and say, you can take a small version of this to the surface of the moon and show, to demonstrate, to prove that we can separate out thorium, and now we can transmute that into uranium using the gamma ray fog from deep space. And now we can have nuclear thermal rockets, so we can get to Mars in half the time. And if we use my hydrogen storage technology, which can be made entirely from lunar materials, and use that to surround the crew capsule, we protect them from the deadly galactic cosmic rays that make traveling to Mars so incredibly difficult. So that one first step is how IUPUI can exert the leverage to open up all of space for everybody, to bring those resources back to Earth and have people finally say, oh, now that I see how space can help me, I love it.
Dr. Schubert, I just feel like it should be you leading the space cause, not Elon Musk with your wonderful ideas.
And I definitely hope you get that funding that you're looking for and hire all of us here at SEDS to work for you. We'll be happy to do so. That being said, thank you so much for taking the time today for being part of our pilot episode of our podcast. We want to thank you so much for the support that you have for this club, and also for the students who you give opportunities to and let them explore space. And we hope that you keep carrying forward this amazing enthusiasm that you have about space, and you keep inspiring the students of IUPUI. So thank you once again. And
pleasure. And let me know how I can help with the club. Thank you for your leadership. And it's been a pleasure talking with you two gentlemen.